As a young boy, he lived a very comfortable life near an English coastal city. His father was a deacon in the church. But when he was 16, everything changed in this boy's life. Pirates attacked his village, and he was abducted and sold into slavery, and the one that owned him forced him to work with the pigs. He spent 6 years as a slave before he was able to escape, and of course, as he found his way home, his family embraced him. The experience just totally changed his life, as any kind of experience like that would. He basically experienced what Paul writes to the church at Ephesus in our second reading. By grace you have been saved. Paul writes of the immeasurable riches of grace. Grace. God gifting us with new insight and new perspective. God gifting us with strength to deal with even the most difficult experiences of our lives. Well, of course, if you haven't figured it out yet, the story of the boy that I was relating to you is the story of the man who millions have been and will be drinking to this weekend at so many Irish bars around the country. The boy that was sold into slavery was Patrick. And Patrick wrote of his life-changing experience when he was 16 in a work he entitled Confessions. He wrote, "I was 16 and knew not the true God. But in a strange land, the Lord opened my unbelieving eyes, and I was converted." Patrick became convinced that the kidnapping and the homesickness were actually opportunities for him to know Christ better. And he went on to write, "Anything that happens to me, whether pleasant or distasteful, I ought to accept with serenity, giving thanks to God, God who never disappoints," he writes. And knowing that this serenity didn't come from his own strength, he wrote, "Now I understand that it was the fervent Spirit praying within me." When he got back to England, he admits in his writings, he said, "It's not my nature to show mercy to those who enslaved me." But God's grace worked once again. And he writes that God intervened, that he had a dream, that he was called to return to Ireland, not as a slave, but to herald the gospel. And when he told his family this, they were horrified that he would do this. They thought he was wasting his life with those enemies of his. And during his life, he passionately spoke against slavery and against all that had happened to him as a young boy. But he was captivated by God's grace. He wrote, "And I am certain of this. I was a dumb stone lying squashed in the mud. The mighty and merciful God came, dug me out, and set me on top of the wall. Therefore I praise him and ought to render him something for his wonderful benefits to me, both now and in eternity." The mighty and merciful God came, dug me out, and set me on top of the hill. That's grace. That's what grace is all about. It's about a God who's involved in our lives, constantly giving us strength and renewed perspective to deal with the difficulties and challenges of our lives. Grace is not about a God who intervenes or takes away all of our pain or our losses or our heartaches, but it's about a God who has been through the pain of crucifixion and abandonment, who is with us in our crucifixions and in our rejections. That's what grace is all about. And each one of us, as believers or struggling believers, each one of us has to decide how we will tackle life. Will we see it as challenges to be met and all of our difficulties as opportunities to use God-given grace to become even stronger and more alive? Or will we spend our days complaining that life is just too hard and life makes too many demands on us? There's a story that goes about a daughter complaining to her father about how hard things were for her. She said to him, "As soon as one problem is solved, another one comes up, and I'm tired of struggling," she said. Her father was a chef, and he took her to the kitchen and he filled 3 pots with water, and he placed each one on a hot fire. Soon the pots came to a boil. In one of the pots he placed carrots, in the second one he placed eggs, and in the last one he placed ground coffee beans. He let them sit and boil without saying a word to his daughter, and she sat there impatiently waiting and wondering what exactly he was doing. Well, after a while he went over and turned off the burners, and he fished out the carrots and placed them in a bowl, and he pulled out the eggs and placed them in a bowl. And he poured the coffee into a bowl. And turning to his daughter, he said, "What do you see?" And she said, "Well, carrots, eggs, and coffee." But he brought her closer, and he asked her to feel the carrots. She did, and she said, "Well, they're soft." And then he asked her to take the egg and break it, and after pulling off the shell, she observed the hard-boiled egg. Finally, he asked her to sip the coffee. She smiled as she tasted its extremely rich flavor. And so she said, "Well, what does this mean, Dad?" And he explained to her. He said, each of them had faced the same adversity, boiling water, but each reacted differently. The carrots went in strong and hard and unrelenting, but being subjected to the boiling water, they softened and became weak. The egg was fragile. Its thin outer shell had protected its liquid interior, but after sitting through the boiling water, its insides hardened. The ground coffee beans were unique, however. By being in the boiling water, they changed the water. And so the father asked his daughter, "When adversity knocks on your door, which are you?" There's a professor of religious studies by the name of Lynn Huber, and she wrote her dissertation on aging. And she interviewed a 90-year-old black woman who simply astounded her. This woman lived on the second floor of an unappealing, foul-smelling, and dilapidated shack. She was in very poor physical condition, and the author, Lynn, admits that when she was there, she did not want to be there. But 3 hours later, when she left, she writes that she knew she was in the presence of grace. The woman with failing hearing and eyesight, bad arthritis so bad she rarely got out, with little money and lots of pain, who had outlived both of her husbands and all 9 of her children, was a person living by grace. And she said something to Lynn that this author will never forget. She said, "God keeps taking stuff away from me, and every time he does, I mourns a while, and then he fills me with more of himself." And the only way that the author in her dissertation could describe this woman was to say, she was marinated in God. She was grace-filled. So this weekend, this 4th weekend of our Lenten season, when so many celebrate Patrick was faced with adversity, and he allowed grace to enable him to change the water. By grace you have been saved. Paul writes of the immeasurable riches of his grace. God giving us new insight, new perspective, new strength to deal with even the most difficult experiences of our lives. Patrick, the man who so many use as a great excuse to tip a few, lived by the grace of God. He was thrust into boiling water many times in his life, and he changed it. We all know that life often thrusts each one of us in boiling water. That same grace is available to each one of us to change the nature of that water. So when adversity knocks on our door, as it will, what are we? Are we carrots? Are we eggs? Or are we rich coffee beans?